I am Abigail Beatrice. I am 22 years old, and 3 months ago my older sister banned me from her wedding for being an aesthetic liability. She told me my country vibe would embarrass her wealthy new in-laws, so I was formally uninvited while sitting right across from her at our own Sunday dinner table. I was told to stay in the barn where I belonged. What my sister did not realize was that by locking me out of her venue, she gave me the best seat in the house to watch her fake life implode on national television. Welcome back to QT Told Stories, where quiet boundaries do the heavy lifting. If you have ever been the family scapegoat who walked away and came out on top, I want to know how old you are and where you are watching from today. Drop your age in the comments and subscribe if you want to hear exactly how this ends. The ban was issued over pot roast at my parents' house in Lexington, Kentucky. I had come straight from the equine physical therapy clinic where I work, my favorite leather boots scuffing the threshold. My sister Vanessa sat at the head of the dining table, dealing thick gold foil envelopes like a card shark. She handed one to our aunt. She handed one to our cousin. She reached the end of the stack, folded her manicured hands, and looked right at me. "I am keeping the guest list tight, Abigail," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with practiced pity. "The Daltons are a different tier of society. Preston and his family expect a certain polish. Your whole clumsy country aesthetic just does not fit the vision for a Dalton event. You understand?" The Daltons were old-money Kentucky aristocracy. They owned half the thoroughbreds in the county, and threw parties that required signed non-disclosure agreements. I spent my days in the mud, rehabbing the animals they raced. In this dining room, I was just the girl who did not know how to pair the right wine with the fish course. I looked at my mother, Patricia. She was not looking at me. She was staring at the floorboards near my feet. She reached down with her cloth napkin and wiped a speck of barn dust off the polished oak. "Do not ruin her big day, Abigail," my mother said, never glancing up. "Just sit this one out. It is easier." I did not yell. I did not flip my chair or throw my sweet tea. I felt the familiar dull ache of being erased, the same ache I had carried since childhood. I simply nodded, pushed my chair back, and walked out the front door. As my boots hit the gravel driveway, a black Range Rover pulled up. Preston Dalton, the golden groom, stepped out. He looked flustered, carrying a thick manila folder under his arm. The evening wind caught the cover, flipping it open just enough for me to see the bold, unmistakable logo printed on the veterinary file inside. Ironwood Equine. My blood ran cold. Ironwood was not a prestigious breeding facility. They were a shadow operation notorious on the Bluegrass Whisper network for doping lame horses to pass elite vet checks. Preston smiled at me, oblivious, tucking the folder under his arm as he hurried inside to kiss my sister. I stood on the porch, the summer humidity pressing in. Vanessa was not just marrying into high society, she was bringing a lit match into their house. I drove away from my parents' house with the radio off, letting the steady hum of my truck engine regulate my breathing. The transition from their pristine Lexington neighborhood to my world always felt like crossing a heavily guarded border. My sanctuary sits 20 miles outside the city limits, tucked down a rutted gravel road where the manicured, multi-million-dollar bluegrass estates finally give way to rusted wire fencing and honest working farms. I run an equine rehabilitation center. It is not pretty, and it does not smell like expensive perfume. It smells like sharp liniment, damp earth, sweet feed, and hard sweat. For 3 years, I have poured every ounce of my physical and mental energy into this place. I spend my days rebuilding damaged tendons and soothing shattered nerves in horses that wealthy owners simply toss aside when they stop winning. I learned this trade from Wyatt, a gruff local legend with a bad knee and a notorious temper. Wyatt taught me early on that a horse does not care about your family pedigree or the price tag on your boots. A horse only cares about your patience and your quiet strength. He took a chance on me when I was just 19, handing me a frayed lead rope and telling me to figure it out. Now my name is the one listed on the property deed. I built a thriving, respected business with my own 2 blistered hands. But to my mother and sister, I remain just a stubborn girl playing in the dirt, a blue-collar embarrassment to their high society aspirations. Tuesday morning, I was crouched in stall number 4, carefully wrapping a thoroughbred's bowed tendon, when my phone vibrated in the front pocket of my denim jacket. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Patricia. I hesitated, then answered, wedging the phone between my ear and my shoulder so I could keep my hands flat on the bandage. "Abigail," my mother said. Her tone was brisk and businesslike, adopting the exact voice she usually reserved for negotiating a lower price on a catering bill. "I am glad I caught you. We need to discuss a minor logistical hiccup regarding the wedding." I pulled the cohesive tape tight around the horse's legs, securing the padding in place. "You mean the wedding I am currently banned from attending?" "Do not be difficult," she sighed heavily, sounding as if my exclusion was a simple scheduling error that I was being overly dramatic about. "This is actually a wonderful opportunity for you to support your sister from behind the scenes. A silent sisterly duty, if you will. Vanessa has run into a slight budget issue with the florist. The Dalton family expects imported orchids and peonies for the reception hall, and the final invoice is due this week." The thoroughbred standing next to me lowered his heavy head, grabbing a mouthful of dry alfalfa hay. The rhythmic, steady crunching sound filled the quiet barn. That simple, grounding noise anchored me to reality, while my mother drifted further into her arrogant delusion. "What does Vanessa's floral budget have to do with me?" I asked, smoothing the final layer of the wrap and standing up to brush the sawdust off my knees. "I need you to cover the remaining balance," Patricia stated. "It was not a question or a polite request, it was a royal decree. It is $15,000. I know your little horse clinic is doing well, and you do not have the same social expenses your sister does. You are the strong one, Abigail. You can handle the financial hit. Vanessa is delicate, and this stress is ruining her complexion. You owe it to this family to invest in her future." Invest in her future. My mother spoke about me as if I were a walking automated teller machine, an entity existing solely to fund the golden child's aesthetic perfection. She had just banned me from the venue a mere 48 hours ago, deeming my presence too unrefined to breathe the same air as her wealthy guests. Yet somehow, my blue-collar money was polished enough to buy their table centerpieces. The horse shifted his weight, chewing another mouthful of hay. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold, hard edge of a permanent boundary forming deep inside my chest. "No," I said. Silence stretched across the phone line. It was the heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that usually precedes a severe weather warning. "Excuse me?" Patricia whispered, her voice dropping an octave. "I am not giving you $15,000 for orchids," I replied, keeping my voice level and devoid of emotion. "I am not funding a luxury wedding that I am barred from attending. My money stays in my business." The storm broke. My mother's voice spiked into a sharp, shrill register that echoed loudly off the tin roof of the barn. She told me I was selfish. She called me bitter and ungrateful. She reminded me of every meal I had eaten under her roof and every dollar they had ever spent on my childhood upbringing. When the guilt trip failed to produce a tearful apology or an open checkbook from me, she instantly pivoted to a vicious threat. "You think you are so independent out there in the mud," she hissed, the venom seeping through the speaker. "But you rely on the goodwill of this community to keep your doors open. People around here listen to me, Abigail. If you refuse to support your own flesh and blood, I will make sure everyone in Lexington knows exactly what kind of ungrateful daughter you really are. Good luck getting wealthy clients when I tell the country club how you abandoned your sister on the most important day of her life." I listened to the threat land. My own mother was promising to destroy my professional reputation over flower arrangements. I did not argue. I did not defend my character. I just pressed the red button on my screen and let the call disconnect. My hands were shaking slightly, but I forced myself to walk out of the stall smoothly, latching the heavy wooden door behind me. You cannot let a prey animal feel your internal panic. Wyatt was standing at the end of the center aisle, leaning heavily on a pitchfork. He did not ask what the phone call was about. He took one look at my pale face, grunted, and nodded toward the tack room where we kept the main office computer. "Check your messages," Wyatt said, his raspy voice breaking the tension. "Something weird came through the website intake form this morning while you were out back." I walked into the small, dusty office. The computer screen glowed in the dim light, illuminating the tack trunks and bridles hanging on the walls. I opened my business inbox, my heart still racing from the confrontation with my mother. There was a new email sitting at the very top of the queue. The subject line was marked urgent. The sender was anonymous, hiding behind a generic encrypted email address, but the inquiry itself was highly specific and deeply concerning. The potential client was looking for a discreet, off-the-grid rehabilitation specialist to handle a $1 million thoroughbred stallion. The horse was suffering from a mysterious, undiagnosed lameness issue, and the owner needed someone far outside the elite veterinary circle to evaluate the animal without alerting their racing syndicate investors. I read the tragic details of the injury, my professional curiosity overriding my lingering anger. Then I scrolled down to the bottom of the message to review the attached medical history. My breath hitched in my throat. The initial intake forms and diagnostic charts were signed by the current primary physician and associate at Ironwood Equine. It was the very same shadow clinic I had seen printed on the folder Preston Dalton carried up my parents' porch just 2 days ago. The aristocratic family my sister was marrying into was secretly reaching out to my clinic. They were desperate for help, deliberately bypassing the high society veterinarians to find a gritty bluegrass expert who could keep their secrets safe. My mother had just threatened to ruin my reputation among the wealthy elites, having no idea that the wealthiest family in the entire state had already found me. I stared at the glowing screen, realizing the irony of the situation. Vanessa was busy curating a flawless aesthetic to impress the Dalton family, while the Dalton family was quietly seeking out the exact dirt-stained expertise my sister despised. I hit the reply button, typing out a brief message to schedule a private consultation. As I hit send, I knew I was inviting chaos into my quiet sanctuary, but some secrets demand to be uncovered. The morning humidity hung thick over the Bluegrass Valley, coating the metal gate of the round pen in a thin layer of dew. I spent the early hours working with Bourbon, a retired bay gelding whose racing career ended with a fractured sesamoid bone. Out here, there are no crystal chandeliers or imported silk tablecloths. There is only the rhythm of breath, the smell of damp soil, and the slow, agonizing process of teaching a broken animal how to trust its own legs again. I guided Bourbon through his ground poles, watching the way his left hind hoof struck the dirt. This was my sanctuary. I had deliberately registered my clinic under the business name Bluegrass Equine Recovery, keeping my family surname off the state paperwork. That legal shield kept my toxic lineage away from my livelihood. It also ensured that the man driving a pristine silver Mercedes up my gravel driveway had no clue who he was about to meet. The luxury vehicle rolled to a stop near the main feed silo, looking painfully out of place against the backdrop of weathered barn siding and sun-bleached tractor tires. The driver shifted into park and stepped out into the damp Kentucky morning. It was Preston Dalton. Up close, without the shadows of my parents' porch obscuring his features, the groom looked younger and far more exhausted than his high society photographs suggested. He wore a tailored navy blazer and crisp khakis, an outfit suited for a country club brunch rather than a working rehabilitation yard. Preston took 2 steps toward the barn before looking down in dismay. The heavy spring mud was already clinging to the edges of his expensive Italian leather loafers. He paused, pulling a white handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the dark grime away from the designer stitching. He seemed entirely out of his element, a polished prince standing in a kingdom built on sweat and manure. I stood quietly in the center of the round pen, holding Bourbon by a simple nylon halter. The gelding tossed his heavy head, feeling the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The stranger unsettled him. I ran my hand down the thick muscle of the horse's neck, applying a steady grounding pressure until his breathing slowed. I did not call out to Preston. I let him navigate the muck and find his way to me. Preston approached the metal fencing, keeping a cautious distance from the snorting bay thoroughbred. He introduced himself formally, extending a hand over the top rail. He asked for the head therapist at Bluegrass Equine Recovery, referencing the urgent email exchange from the previous afternoon. I shook his hand, my calloused fingers contrasting sharply with his soft manicured grip. I introduced myself simply as the clinic owner, offering no last name and maintaining a mask of professional indifference. He did not recognize me. To the Dalton family, Vanessa's sister was just an uncultured embarrassment hidden away in the shadows. He had never seen my face up close. Preston sighed, his rigid posture sagging with genuine defeat. He confessed that he was in a precarious situation and needed a discreet expert. The Dalton Racing Syndicate, controlled with an iron fist by his father, was in the final stages of closing a lucrative acquisition. Preston explained that they had recently purchased a highly touted thoroughbred prospect, a horse expected to anchor their upcoming racing season. The animal cost the family a staggering $2.5 million, but there was a glaring problem: the horse was failing. According to Preston, the stallion had started exhibiting a mysterious intermittent limp shortly after arriving at their private training facility. "I need someone outside the Lexington inner circle," Preston said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Someone who will not run straight to my father with a status report. If he finds out I authorized a multi-million-dollar purchase on a defective animal, my standing within the syndicate is over." He needed an independent evaluation, someone far removed from the gossip circles, to fix the issue quietly before the upcoming wedding festivities began. I listened to his plea, keeping my expression neutral while my mind raced. "What prompted such a large investment in a horse with a questionable medical background?" I asked. Preston smiled, a fond, admiring look crossing his face. "My fiancé spotted him," he replied. "Vanessa is a brilliant equine strategist. She designed the recovery protocols that saved a champion racehorse 2 years ago. She spent long nights studying tendon sonograms and researching advanced hydrotherapy regimens. She knows exactly what to look for." The words hit me like a physical blow. The air in my lungs turned cold. The hydrotherapy regimen Preston described was the exact protocol I had developed and published in a regional veterinary journal last spring. The late nights studying sonograms were my nights spent hunched over a glowing screen in this very barn, while Vanessa was out drinking champagne at charity galas. Growing up, my sister constantly mocked me for smelling like the barn. She called my passion a dirty hobby. Now she had stolen my entire professional identity. She took the grueling, unglamorous work I had poured my soul into and repackaged it as her own brilliant expertise to impress a billionaire heir. She used my life's dedication to secure her marriage proposal, effectively wearing my achievements like a borrowed designer dress. I looked at Preston, seeing not just a wealthy aristocrat, but a gullible pawn in a deeply deceptive game. He was risking his family fortune on the word of a woman who did not know the difference between a fetlock and a forelock. Preston begged me to take the case. He promised to pay triple my usual rate, provided I maintained total confidentiality. He said the horse would be transported to my facility under the cover of darkness. He needed answers, and he needed them before the syndicate finalized their racing roster. I looked down at the mud covering the toes of my boots. Taking this job meant crossing a dangerous line. I would be stepping directly into a high-stakes financial minefield that could detonate and destroy my own career. If the Dalton patriarch discovered I was treating their prized asset without official authorization, the legal fallout could bankrupt my clinic. Moreover, accepting this patient meant becoming tangled in the very wedding I had been banned from attending. Yet turning Preston away meant letting Vanessa succeed in her fraud. It meant allowing a potentially injured animal to be forced onto a racetrack, risking a catastrophic breakdown at high speeds. Wyatt had taught me that our primary duty was always to the horse, regardless of the human politics surrounding it. I could not abandon a suffering creature just to protect myself from my toxic relatives. I raised my eyes and met Preston's desperate gaze. I told him to arrange the transport for midnight. I instructed him to bring all the veterinary records, emphasizing that I needed every single document his fiancée had used to justify the purchase. Preston exhaled a long breath of relief, thanking me profusely before carefully picking his way back through the mud to his luxury vehicle. I watched the silver SUV disappear down the gravel road, leaving me alone with the quiet sounds of the barn. I gripped the lead rope, feeling the coarse nylon bite into my palm. My sister wanted me to sit silently in the background while she built a royal life on a foundation of my stolen labor. But the foundation was already cracking, and I was holding the hammer. The stallion arrived at my clinic exactly at midnight, stepping off the transport trailer with a coat as dark as the surrounding sky. He was a magnificent animal, bred for speed and power, yet his eyes were wide with a frantic, uncharacteristic panic. I spent the first 48 hours just sitting in his stall, letting him adjust to the quiet rhythm of my barn before I even attempted a physical evaluation. Preston visited every single afternoon. He would leave his luxury vehicle parked by the main gate and walk down the gravel path, shedding his corporate armor piece by piece. He would sit on a stacked pile of timothy hay, loosening his silk tie, and watch me work. As the days passed, the quiet isolation of the rural property began to lower his defenses. He started talking to fill the silence. He confided in me about the immense pressure of living under his father's iron-fisted rule within the racing syndicate. Eventually, the conversation naturally drifted to his upcoming wedding and the woman who had supposedly saved him from his high society misery. I was running a soft bristled brush over the stallion's powerful shoulder when Preston delivered the sentence that stopped the breath in my lungs. He told me he proposed to Vanessa because she was the only woman in his social circle who actually understood the grueling realities of the equestrian business. He explained that his family had nearly euthanized their previous champion racehorse due to a catastrophic suspensory ligament tear. According to Preston, Vanessa stepped in and single-handedly drafted a revolutionary rehabilitation protocol. Preston leaned forward on the hay bales, his eyes glowing with genuine admiration. He recited the specific medical terminology Vanessa had used. He detailed the exact phases of the hydrotherapy regimen she claimed to have invented. Every single word he spoke belonged to me. 2 years ago, I spent 9 months sleeping on a cot in a freezing tack room designing that exact protocol to save a crippled gelding. I compiled my findings into a comprehensive case study and published it in a regional veterinary medical journal. My sister had taken my peer-reviewed research, memorized the jargon, and presented my life's work to the Dalton family as her own brilliant creation. She had stolen my professional identity to secure a diamond ring and a massive inheritance. I kept the brush moving in long, even strokes across the dark coat of the stallion. My facial muscles felt stiff, but I did not let a single trace of emotion surface. Wyatt had drilled into my head that a good horseman never lets their internal chaos transmit through their hands. Preston stood up from the hay bales, walking over to the wooden tack trunk he had brought from their private training facility. He pulled out a heavy leather halter, intending to help me lead the horse out to the small paddock. "Vanessa bought this for him on her last trip to Paris," Preston said, handing the leather gear across the stall door. "She told me the artisan crafting these pieces only sells to exclusive European clients. It is supposed to prevent chafing on his pole." I took the halter from his outstretched hand. The leather was supple and rich, but my eyes immediately locked onto the intricate stitching along the noseband. It was a complex geometric pattern utilizing a very specific, durable waxed thread. I recognized the uneven tension on the third loop of the diamond motif. I recognized it because I had spent 3 weeks tooling that exact pattern by hand. I crafted that halter on my own workbench as a graduation gift for Vanessa, hoping to bridge the growing divide between us. She had thrown it into the back of her closet, calling it a smelly homemade trinket. Now she was passing it off to a billionaire as a rare Parisian import. A hot wave of fury crashed over me. I wanted to throw the handmade leather into the dirt. I wanted to look this naive, trusting man in the eye and scream the truth about the fraud he was about to marry. But I forced myself to breathe. I knew exactly how that confrontation would play out. Without undeniable documented proof, Preston would confront Vanessa, and my sister would immediately call our mother. Patricia would unleash a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She would spin a tragic narrative about a jealous, estranged sister living in squalor, trying to sabotage a beautiful, high-society romance out of pure spite. I would be permanently discredited, and the Dalton patriarch would crush my small clinic under a mountain of defamation lawsuits. I needed more than just a stolen research paper and a recognized piece of leather to expose them. I placed the halter gently on the wooden hook outside the stall, redirecting my focus entirely to the stallion. The animal had a pronounced irregular hitch in his stride when he walked, a mechanical failure that did not align with a simple soft tissue injury. Vanessa had convinced Preston that the horse merely needed a few weeks of specialized conditioning, but my hands told a completely different story. I felt a subtle, hard swelling around the lower knee joint, a subtle heat that indicated deep systemic inflammation. I told Preston I needed to run a comprehensive metabolic panel to rule out any underlying infections. I pulled a sterile syringe from my medical kit, swabbing the thick jugular vein on the side of the stallion's neck. The horse stood perfectly still, trusting the calm energy I projected. I drew the dark red fluid, transferring it into 3 separate glass vials. I sent the samples to an independent, out-of-state laboratory, bypassing the local bluegrass clinics that might recognize the Dalton family name or share the data with Ironwood Equine. The expedited results arrived in my secure inbox 48 hours later. I sat alone in my small barn office staring at the digital spreadsheet. The numbers on the screen were impossible to misinterpret. The stallion was not suffering from a minor muscle strain or a lack of conditioning. The blood chemistry revealed staggering, highly toxic levels of synthetic corticosteroids and powerful nerve-blocking agents. Someone had been systematically pumping the animal full of illegal painkillers to mask a severe degenerative bone disease. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Ironwood Equine was notorious for doping injured horses to pass elite pre-sale veterinary inspections. Preston had mentioned that Vanessa personally recommended this specific horse and handled the initial medical vetting herself. My sister had not just stolen my identity to look smart at a dinner party. She was actively complicit in a massive financial scam. She had used my stolen credentials to establish herself as a trusted expert, guiding the Dalton syndicate into purchasing a defective dying animal for $2.5 million. If Preston raced this horse under those masking agents, the bone would shatter at 40 miles per hour. The horse would die and the jockey could easily be killed. The conflict had just escalated from a painful family betrayal to a highly illegal, life-threatening conspiracy, and I was the only person holding the physical evidence. I needed more than just a toxic blood sample to prove a conspiracy of this scale. I needed the origin story. The bluegrass equine industry operates on a tight network of whispers, favors, and hidden ledgers. Having spent my entire adult life navigating the gritty underbelly of horse rehabilitation, I had built a quiet arsenal of reliable contacts. These were the working-class professionals who actually kept the Kentucky racing machine running, the people who saw every transaction long before the wealthy owners toasted their purchases with expensive champagne. I locked the clinic office door, sliding the heavy metal deadbolt into place. I pulled up an encrypted messaging application on my secure laptop. I reached out to a former colleague, a seasoned veterinary technician, who recently took a desk job at the State Racing Commission's records department. I asked her to pull the unedited transfer history, the initial bill of sale, and the medical disclosure forms for the stallion. I provided the specific microchip number I had scanned off the side of the horse's neck earlier that morning. She owed me a significant favor for nursing her retired jumper back to health 2 winters ago, charging her only for the cost of bandages. Within an hour, a secure digital file dropped into my inbox. The encrypted folder contained a labyrinth of ownership transfers, health certificates, and broker agreements. I printed every single page, listening to the rhythmic whir of the old inkjet printer. I spread the stark white sheets across my scratched wooden desk. The overhead barn light flickered, casting long, erratic shadows over the paperwork that held my sister's secrets. The timeline laid out before me was a masterpiece of deception. 6 months ago, the stallion was flagged at a minor claiming race with a severe bone density issue. A reputable veterinarian had recommended immediate retirement, noting the high probability of a catastrophic fracture. Instead of ending his career safely, the horse was quietly sold for a fraction of his value to Ironwood Equine, the very same shadow breeding operation I had identified on Preston's folder. Ironwood held the horse for 90 days. During that critical window, the animal vanished from all official training rosters and public workout logs. It was the exact time frame required to heavily medicate the horse, masking the degenerative joint disease with synthetic corticosteroids and illegal nerve blockers. Then came the ultimate grift. The paperwork showed that the stallion was listed for private sale as a prime healthy racing prospect. The Dalton Racing Syndicate purchased the animal for $2.5 million. But the wealthy syndicate did not deal directly with Ironwood Equine. The transaction was facilitated by an independent equine consultant, a middleman acting as a trusted advisor to the buyers. The broker listed on the official bill of sale was a newly registered limited liability company called Bluegrass Aesthetic Consulting. I pulled up the state business registry portal on my computer. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a brief second before I typed in the name of the consulting firm. The page loaded, displaying the public articles of incorporation. The registered agent and sole proprietor was Vanessa Beatrice. My sister had orchestrated the entire transaction. She utilized my stolen rehabilitation research to position herself as a visionary expert to Preston and his powerful father. Once she gained their implicit trust, she steered their syndicate capital directly into the hands of the most corrupt breeders in the state. Furthermore, the broker agreement detailed a standard 20% finder's fee for the consultant who facilitated the acquisition. I did the math in my head, the numbers echoing loudly in the quiet office. That meant Vanessa was legally contracted to receive a $500,000 kickback. The payout date was scheduled for the upcoming Monday, exactly 24 hours after she was set to say her wedding vows and officially join the Dalton dynasty. I sat back in my worn desk chair, the cheap metal springs groaning under the sudden shift in weight. I stared at the final document in the stack. It was the pre-purchase health clearance, the official veterinary sign-off, declaring the stallion sound for elite racing. The signature at the bottom purportedly belonged to the head physician at Ironwood, but the ink strokes looked strangely familiar. The curves of the letters were too deliberate and rounded, lacking the hurried, jagged script typical of a busy equine doctor signing off on a routine form. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Tucked beneath a stack of blank treatment logs and spare lead ropes was a small cardboard box containing my few personal keepsakes. I sifted through the items until I found a birthday card from 3 years ago. It was one of the last times Vanessa had pretended to care about my existence, sending a generic greeting card with a brief handwritten note demanding I attend a holiday dinner. I placed the birthday card directly next to the forged health certificate under the flickering fluorescent light. I traced the shape of the blue ink with the tip of my own pen. The loops on the capital letters were identical. The distinct inward slant of the lowercase characters matched perfectly. The pressure marks on the paper were the same. Vanessa had not just brokered a fraudulent sale. She had personally forged the medical clearance documents to ensure the transaction closed without a genuine veterinary inspection. The gravity of her crime settled heavily onto my shoulders, pressing the breath out of my lungs. This situation had escalated far beyond a petty family dispute over flower arrangements or a stolen guest list invitation. It was no longer just about my stolen research or the deep emotional wounds inflicted by my mother. If the Dalton family remained blind to this deception, they would put this stallion on a professional racetrack next month. They would demand peak performance from an animal carrying a hidden degenerative skeletal flaw. Under the extreme kinetic stress of a race, the masked bone would inevitably shatter. A 2,000-pound animal traveling at 40 miles per hour would collapse. The horse would have to be euthanized on the dirt, and the jockey riding him could easily be paralyzed or killed. My sister was willing to risk human and animal lives to secure her royal title and a $500,000 payday. I gathered the printed documents, aligning the edges into a neat, undeniable stack of evidence. I had to intervene. I could no longer stand in the shadows and allow my family to detonate a bomb inside an unsuspecting household. I needed a strategy to deliver this information to the Dalton patriarch without allowing Patricia to intercept and spin the narrative. I reached for a secure, encrypted flash drive sitting on the corner of my desk, planning to digitize the entire paper trail for safekeeping. As my fingers brushed the cold metal of the drive, the sudden crunch of tires on loose gravel broke the quiet rhythm of the barn. I paused, listening closely to the sound carrying through the open center aisle. It was not the low rumbling engine of Preston Dalton's luxury vehicle. It was the sharp, distinct sound of a lighter sedan driving far too fast down my private, unpaved road. I stood up, leaving the paperwork on the scratched desk, and walked over to the small, dust-streaked window overlooking the front gate. A pristine white luxury sedan slammed into park right in front of the main barn entrance, kicking up a cloud of dry summer dust. The driver's side door swung open, and my mother stepped out onto the dirt, wearing a crisp linen suit. A second later, the passenger door opened, and Vanessa emerged wearing designer sunglasses and a tight expression of sheer panic. They had never visited my clinic before. They considered my property a toxic wasteland, a place beneath their polished dignity. Yet here they were, marching toward my sanctuary with undeniable purpose. They did not look like women dropping in for a friendly family chat. They looked like cornered predators. The conflict had just arrived directly at my doorstep. I stepped out of the office and walked down the center aisle of the barn. The air hung thick with the scent of pine shavings and sweet feed. The heavy wooden doors at the front of the structure stood wide open, framing my mother and sister as they marched into my sanctuary. The sharp clicking of Vanessa's designer heels on the concrete threshold sounded like tiny gunshots breaking the afternoon quiet. Patricia followed close behind her golden child. My mother held a large, sweating plastic cup of iced sweet tea, the condensation dripping onto her immaculate linen cuff. She navigated the dirt floor with an air of profound disgust, acting as if she had just been forced to wade through a toxic swamp. They stopped 10 feet away from me. Vanessa did not bother with pleasantries. Her face was flushed, the perfectly contoured makeup failing to hide the frantic tension tightening her jaw. She marched forward, clutching a pristine leather portfolio against her chest. "Where is he?" Vanessa demanded, her voice shrill and echoing off the high tin roof. I stood still, resting my hands by my sides. "You will need to be specific. We house over a dozen patients here." "Do not play stupid with me, Abigail," Vanessa snapped, stepping closer. The scent of her expensive floral perfume clashed harshly with the earthy smell of the barn. I saw the location logs on Preston's phone. I know he brought the new syndicate stallion to this pathetic excuse for a clinic. I know he has been sneaking out here to talk to you. She unzipped the leather portfolio and yanked out a thick stack of stapled legal paper. She shoved the documents toward my chest. "This is a standard non-disclosure agreement," Vanessa stated, her tone shifting into a forced authoritative register. "You are going to sign it right now. Then you are going to hand over every single medical file intake form and blood panel you have generated for that horse. You are going to load the stallion onto a trailer this afternoon and send him back to the Dalton estate." I did not reach for the papers. I looked at the bold legal heading on the front page. Vanessa was terrified. She knew that if I examined the horse, I would instantly recognize the catastrophic joint disease and the illegal masking agents. She was trying to plug a sinking ship with pure intimidation. "The horse is under my professional care," I replied, keeping my vocal tone low and steady. "Preston signed the intake authorization himself. I cannot release medical records to an unauthorized third party, nor can I discharge a patient without the owner's explicit consent." Vanessa scoffed an ugly sound that twisted her manicured features. She had spent her entire life collecting expensive, prestigious university degrees, funded by our parents, degrees she never used for a single day of actual labor. I had built my credentials through grueling apprenticeships and late nights studying anatomy textbooks in cold tack rooms. To her, my hard-earned expertise was nothing more than a blue-collar joke. "You are a dirt-stained, glorified stable hand," Vanessa sneered, gesturing wildly at the dusty rafters above us. "You are way out of your depth, Abigail. You are far too uneducated to treat a Dalton animal. This horse represents a syndicate investment worth millions. If you touch him with your dirty, uncredentialed hands, you will ruin his racing career. Sign the paper and hand over the files before you cause irreparable damage." I reached over to the wooden medical cart beside me and picked up a metal clipboard. Clipped to the front were the devastating blood test results I had just printed. I held the clipboard firmly in my right hand, feeling the solid weight of the truth pressing against my palm. "The only thing ruining his racing career is the degenerative bone disease someone is trying to hide with synthetic corticosteroids," I said quietly. The color drained from Vanessa's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She took a half step backward, her designer heel sinking into a patch of soft dirt. That was when my mother decided to intervene. Patricia took a slow, deliberate sip of her sweet tea. The ice clinked gently against the plastic sides of the cup. She looked around the barn, her eyes scanning the neat rows of stalls, the polished tack hanging on the walls, and the clean raked aisles. She did not see my hard work. She saw leverage. "You have built a nice little setup here," Patricia said, her voice smooth and conversational, forming a jarring contrast to the tension suffocating the aisle. "It would be a terrible shame to lose it all over a stubborn misunderstanding." I shifted my gaze to my mother. "What are you talking about?" Patricia smiled, a cold, thin line stretching across her face. "The State Veterinary Medical Board takes official complaints very seriously, especially when those complaints involve practicing advanced equine medicine without the proper high-level oversight. All it would take is one phone call from a concerned citizen, someone reporting unsanitary conditions, someone claiming you are dispensing unprescribed medications to racehorses." The air in the barn went dead. My own mother was standing in the middle of my livelihood, calmly threatening to fabricate federal crimes to have my operating license permanently revoked. She was willing to destroy my entire future to protect Vanessa's fraudulent marriage. "You would commit perjury to shut down my clinic?" I asked, wanting to hear her confirm the depth of her betrayal out loud. Patricia took another sip of her tea. "I will do whatever is necessary to protect this family's reputation. Your sister is stepping into a very important role within the Lexington community. We cannot have a rogue, disgruntled relative causing embarrassing legal headaches. Give Vanessa the files. Sign the non-disclosure agreement. Do it now, Abigail, or I will make the phone call before I even start my car." I looked at the two women standing before me. For 22 years I had bent over backward trying to earn their respect. I had absorbed their insults, skipped family holidays to avoid their judgment, and stayed quiet to keep the peace. But looking at them now, I realized that peace was a lie. They did not want peace. They wanted my total surrender. I tightened my grip on the metal clipboard. The edges dug into my skin. "No," I said. The word echoed down the long aisle. Vanessa's eyes widened in genuine shock. She was not used to hearing that word. She stepped forward again, the panic returning hotter and sharper than before. "You cannot say no," Vanessa shouted, her facade crumbling. "You do not hold any power here. You think you are so safe in this filthy little barn. You think you own this valley." She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, her voice pitching into a hysterical scream. "Once I have that ring on my finger, I will have access to the Dalton Development Fund. Preston will give me whatever I want, and the very first thing I am going to do is buy the land out from under this pathetic lease. I am going to have bulldozers tear down this rotting wood, and I am going to build a luxury equestrian spa right over the ashes of your stupid clinic. You are going to be left with nothing." The threat hung in the dusty air, ringing in my ears. In her blind rage, Vanessa had just handed me a crucial piece of information. She had shown me her ultimate endgame. She was not just trying to silence me to protect her wedding. She fully intended to return and destroy my sanctuary the moment she secured her new aristocratic power. Patricia reached out and grabbed Vanessa by the arm, pulling her back. My mother realized her golden child had said too much, revealing the vindictive cruelty that Patricia usually preferred to keep hidden behind polite smiles. "We are leaving," Patricia said sharply, dragging Vanessa toward the open barn doors. My mother turned her head, fixing me with a final, chilling stare. "You have made your choice, Abigail. Do not expect any mercy when the consequences arrive." They turned their backs on me, marching out into the bright afternoon sun. The white luxury sedan started with a quiet purr, the tires spitting gravel as Patricia threw the car into reverse and sped down the long driveway. I stood alone in the center aisle, the dust settling slowly around my boots. They believed they had terrified me into submission. They thought their threats would force me to bury the blood tests and hide in the shadows while they executed their scam. I looked down at the metal clipboard in my hand. The fear they had tried to instill in me evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. They had just shown me that avoiding the conflict would not save me. If I stayed silent, Vanessa would take the Dalton fortune and use it to eradicate my business. I did not just need to protect the horse anymore. I needed to protect my own survival. I walked back into my office and locked the door behind me. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a fresh encrypted flash drive. It was time to prepare my defense. I sat in the dim light of the office, the adrenaline slowly draining from my veins. In its place, a familiar, suffocating weight settled over my chest. It was the ingrained reflex of a lifelong people-pleaser, a trauma response hardwired into my nervous system after 2 decades of conditioning. My survival strategy had always been compliance. Whenever my mother raised her voice, I lowered my head. Whenever Vanessa demanded the spotlight, I faded into the background. My eyes drifted toward the unsigned non-disclosure agreement resting on the edge of the scratched wooden desk. Patricia had not just threatened my personal pride, she had targeted my veterinary license. She threatened to fabricate a state board investigation that could shutter the clinic, seize the animals under my care, and bankrupt me in legal fees. A creeping sense of doubt whispered in my ear. Perhaps it was easier to just sign the document. Perhaps I could hand over the forged blood panels, load the ailing stallion onto a trailer, and wash my hands of the Dalton syndicate forever. If I surrendered, I could preserve my quiet life in the bluegrass. I reached out my fingertips, brushing the edge of the thick legal paper. Heavy footsteps sounded on the wooden floorboards behind me. I pulled my hand back as Wyatt appeared in the office doorway. He leaned his broad shoulder against the doorframe, his weathered face unreadable under the brim of his faded ball cap. He did not ask what had transpired in the aisle. He had been working in the back pasture, but the shrill pitch of my mother's screaming had carried easily over the rolling hills. Wyatt had spent 40 years in the equine industry. Long before he mentored me, he managed a prestigious racing stable down in Florida. He lost that position and nearly his career because he once looked the other way when a wealthy owner demanded he run an injured filly. He spent the next 20 years rebuilding his integrity from the ground up, vowing never to compromise medical ethics for a paycheck. He looked at my trembling hand, then looked at the non-disclosure agreement on the desk. "You are thinking about folding?" Wyatt said, his raspy voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "She threatened to call the state medical board," I whispered, staring down at my dusty boots. "She will lie to the investigators. She will say I am dispensing unprescribed narcotics. I cannot afford to defend myself against the kind of lawyers she can hire. If I lose this barn, I lose everything." Wyatt walked into the office, his bad knee popping slightly with the effort. He picked up the non-disclosure agreement, crumpled the thick pages in his large fist, and tossed the wad of paper into the metal trash can in the corner. "A long time ago, I let a rich man bully me into ignoring a hairline fracture," Wyatt said, leaning over the desk to meet my gaze. "I thought I was saving my job. Instead, I watched that horse break down on the final turn, and I had to carry that guilt for the rest of my life. Your mother is trying to make you complicit in her poison. But listen to me carefully, kid. You do not cover up rot. You cut it out." His words struck a chord deep inside my chest, shattering the fragile layer of doubt. He was right. Signing that paper would not bring me peace. It would make me an active participant in Vanessa's fraud. I would be signing a death warrant for the stallion in stall number 4. I took a deep, steadying breath. I pushed the fear aside and replaced it with cold, deliberate focus. If Patricia intended to fabricate crimes against me, I needed to document her extortion. Last spring, following a string of high-profile saddle thefts in the neighboring county, I invested a significant portion of my clinic profits into a top-tier security system. The setup included high-definition cameras covering every entrance, paired with sensitive audio receivers to monitor the horses during the night. I turned away from the desk and walked over to the small, enclosed server rack humming quietly in the corner of the room. The soft, rhythmic hum of the cooling fans filled the space, a steady, grounding vibration that centered my racing thoughts. I pulled up a stool, logged into the administrative dashboard, and opened the timeline for the exterior driveway camera. I scrubbed the video feed back 30 minutes, watching the digital timestamp reverse until the pristine white luxury sedan appeared on the screen. The car sped down the gravel driveway, braking sharply in front of the main barn doors. I reached for the volume dial on the external speakers, turning it up to catch whatever Patricia had said to Vanessa before they ambushed me in the aisle. The audio feed crackled to life, picking up the crunch of tires on the loose stones. The engine shifted into park, but the car doors did not open immediately. Through the sensitive microphone, I heard a voice echoing from the passenger side. Vanessa had her window rolled down to clear the summer heat, and she was speaking loudly into her cell phone. "I do not care about the transport logistics right now," Vanessa snapped, her tone dripping with arrogant entitlement. "The wire transfer needs to hit my consulting account by Monday morning, or the syndicate will pull their future breeding contracts from Ironwood." I froze my hand, hovering over the mouse. She was on the phone with the shady breeder coordinating the kickback. The muffled voice of a man murmured through the phone speaker. Vanessa let out a sharp, cruel laugh that made my stomach turn. "Relax, he is not going to check the secondary veterinary logs," Vanessa sneered into the phone. "Preston is a gullible trust fund idiot. He signs whatever I put in front of him because he thinks I am the only one who understands his precious horses. Just keep your mouth shut, process the $500,000 consulting fee, and let me handle the Daltons." The call disconnected. A second later, the car doors opened and my mother and sister stepped out to deliver their threats. I sat perfectly still, staring at the frozen frame of the video feed. The soft, rhythmic hum of the security server washed over me. I clicked the export button, watching the green progress bar fill as the system downloaded the video and audio file directly to my secure desktop. The forged medical records and the toxic blood panels were devastating, but a clever lawyer might argue they were circumstantial. Patricia might have found a way to spin the documents, claiming Vanessa was merely naive and had been tricked by the breeders. But this audio recording was an undeniable, bulletproof confession. Vanessa had explicitly stated the exact financial sum of her kickback. She had named the corrupt breeding facility. Most damning of all, she had insulted the Dalton family legacy, reducing her future husband to a gullible mark in a long con. I pulled the encrypted flash drive from the bottom drawer of my desk and plugged it into the server port. I dragged the video file, the blood test results, and the forged broker agreements into a single password-protected folder. The conflict had shifted on its axis. I was no longer on the defensive, gathering proof to protect my clinic from a state board investigation. I held a nuclear bomb capable of leveling my sister's entire fraudulent empire. Yet holding the weapon was only half the battle. I knew I had to deliver this information with surgical precision. If I sent the file directly to Preston, Vanessa would intercept it. She would play the victim, claiming the audio was a deep fake generated by a jealous, estranged sister trying to ruin her wedding. She would use her emotional leverage over him to bury the evidence. I needed to bypass Preston entirely. I needed to deliver the evidence to the apex predator of the racing syndicate, someone immune to Vanessa's tears and highly protective of the Dalton family fortune. I removed the flash drive, feeling the cool metal against my palm. My path was clear, but a lingering shadow of familial loyalty tugged at the edges of my conscience. Destroying Vanessa meant bringing public ruin to my parents as well. Before I pulled the trigger, I needed to know if there was a single person left in my bloodline worth saving. I needed to know if my father was a victim of Patricia's manipulation or a willing participant in the rot. I sent a brief text message to my father asking him to meet me at a neutral location. I chose an old, faded diner out on the county highway, far away from the polished country clubs and upscale bistros where my parents usually spent their afternoons. The diner smelled like fried potatoes and stale coffee, a humble setting where pretense held no value. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth near the back window, ordering a simple glass of iced water. I needed a clear head. I was holding a digital confession that would dismantle my sister, but a lingering thread of childhood hope tethered me to the past. I wanted to believe that my father, Thomas, was merely a victim of my mother's overbearing control. I needed to know if he possessed the courage to act like a parent before I unleashed the truth. Thomas arrived 15 minutes late. He walked through the glass door wearing pressed khaki slacks and a pale blue button-down shirt. He navigated the narrow aisle between the tables with a hesitant, apologetic posture. My father had spent his entire adult life keeping his head down. He was a man who learned early on that agreeing with Patricia was the only way to secure a quiet evening. He had traded his spine for domestic tranquility long before I was even born, allowing his wife to dictate the emotional climate of our household. By default, that meant sacrificing his youngest daughter to appease the golden child. He slid into the booth across from me, offering a tight, uncomfortable smile. A tired waitress appeared, pouring a fresh cup of black coffee into the thick porcelain mug sitting in front of him. Thomas thanked her, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. He did not ask how my clinic was doing. He did not ask how I was handling the cruel wedding ban. He just stared at the scarred tabletop, waiting for me to speak. "Dad," I began, keeping my voice gentle, "I need you to listen to me. I am not here to argue about the wedding invitations or the flower arrangements. I am here because Vanessa is in very real danger, and she is dragging the rest of the family down with her." Thomas sighed a long, weary exhalation that rustled the paper napkins in the dispenser. He reached for a silver spoon resting next to his mug. "Abigail, please," Thomas said, his tone thick with exhaustion. "Your mother is already under an immense amount of stress coordinating the caterers. The Daltons are demanding perfection. Do not add to the drama right now. We all just want a smooth weekend." I leaned forward across the table, refusing to let him deflect the conversation. This has nothing to do with catering. Vanessa is facilitating a financial scam. She partnered with a corrupt breeding operation to sell a disabled, heavily medicated stallion to the Dalton Racing Syndicate. She forged medical clearance documents, and she is collecting a massive illegal kickback on Monday morning. I waited for the shock to register on his face. I waited for the paternal outrage, the sudden realization that his eldest daughter was committing a serious felony. I offered him the truth on a silver platter, giving him the opportunity to intervene and stop the wedding before the authorities became involved. Thomas did not look up. He picked up the silver spoon and dipped it into his mug. He began to stir his black coffee. The metal spoon clinked rhythmically against the sides of the porcelain. The sound filled the space between us, steady and maddening. He focused his entire attention on the dark, swirling liquid. He awkwardly avoided eye contact, his shoulders tense, his jaw locked in a stubborn grimace. He did not ask to see the forged signatures. He did not demand to know the name of the corrupt breeder. He did not care about the facts. "You always do this," Thomas muttered, his eyes still fixed on the coffee. "You find a way to complicate things whenever the attention shifts away from your horses." Vanessa found a good man. She found a family that can provide a stable, respectable future for her. You need to stop making waves. The silver spoon continued to trace circles in the mug. The gentle clinking sound struck my ears like a final verdict. "She is defrauding a billionaire racing syndicate, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet whisper. "If that horse breaks a leg on the track, the jockey could die. Does that matter to you?" Thomas finally stopped stirring. He placed the spoon down on the table, but he still refused to look me in the eye. He stared at the salt shaker sitting near my elbow. "You have chosen your path out in the dirt," Thomas said, his voice hardening with a defensive edge. "Let your sister have her moment in the sun." I sat back against the cracked vinyl booth. The cold air conditioning hummed from a vent above my head, chilling the damp skin on the back of my neck. In that single, cowardly sentence, my father revealed the true depth of his betrayal. He was not a helpless hostage in my mother's house. He was a willing accomplice. He would rather let me carry the burden of a criminal conspiracy than suffer through a difficult conversation with his wife. He would gladly let me burn if it meant keeping his living room quiet. The lingering guilt that had haunted me for years simply dissolved. The invisible tether tying me to their approval snapped clean in half. For 2 decades, I had mistakenly believed that my family was broken because I was not trying hard enough to fix them. Looking at my father, shrinking into his booth to avoid reality, I finally understood the truth. Protecting a toxic family does not heal them. It only enables their poison to spread. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a $5 bill, and laid it on the table to cover my untouched water and his coffee. "Enjoy the wedding," I said. I stood up and walked out of the diner without looking back. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful note as I stepped into the warm afternoon sun. I felt lighter than I had in years. The emotional fog had lifted, leaving behind a sharp, unforgiving clarity. I no longer hoped for their love. I was fully committed to my professional duty and my own self-respect. I drove straight back to the clinic, my mind operating with calculated precision. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the main barn. Wyatt was out in the back pasture leading a recovering mare through her physical therapy routine. The property was quiet, safe, and entirely mine. I walked into my office and locked the door. I sat down at my scratched wooden desk and booted up my secure laptop. I had gathered the raw materials of my sister's downfall, but now I needed to forge them into a cohesive weapon. I plugged a fresh, heavy-duty flash drive into the side port of the computer. I opened the digital folders I had created earlier in the day. First, I transferred the expedited blood panel results, clearly highlighting the lethal concentrations of synthetic nerve blockers and toxic masking agents. Next, I dragged over the high-resolution scans of the forged health clearance certificates, placing them side by side with the digital photographs of Vanessa's distinct handwriting from my old birthday card. Finally, I added the crown jewel of the collection. I uploaded the crisp, high-definition security camera footage, capturing the barn ambush, ensuring the audio track of Vanessa coordinating her illegal kickback was perfectly synced and isolated. I organized the files into a single, straightforward directory labeled with the stallion's official registration number. I launched my encryption software, locking the sensitive data behind a complex security protocol. I wanted to ensure that if the drive fell into the wrong hands, it would remain an impenetrable vault. The progress bar marched across the screen, a silent countdown to the end of my sister's reign. The computer chimed, signaling the completion of the transfer. I safely ejected the flash drive and held it in my palm. It felt heavy, loaded with the weight of shattered illusions and undeniable facts. I was ready to deliver the truth, but I knew I could not simply hand it over to Preston. I needed to bypass the groom and aim higher up the social ladder. I needed a strategy to put this evidence directly into the hands of the one man who controlled the Dalton fortune, setting a trap my family could never escape. 3 days remained until the high society event of the decade. The Kentucky summer heat had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, dry breeze that swept through the open doors of my clinic. I spent the late afternoon secluded in the quiet sanctuary of the tack room. The air inside smelled of neatsfoot oil, cedarwood, and old dust. I sat on a low wooden stool, resting a heavy western saddle across my knees. Wyatt had owned this particular piece of gear for 20 years. The leather was deeply scarred from decades of hard labor, etched with the history of 1,000 early mornings and late nights. I dipped a soft rag into a tin of conditioning paste, working the rich wax into the worn fenders with slow, deliberate circles. My cell phone buzzed against the wooden workbench, the harsh digital vibration disrupting the peaceful rhythm of my task. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed Patricia's name. I did not feel the familiar spike of anxiety that used to accompany her calls. The diner conversation with my father had surgically removed the last traces of my childhood vulnerability. I wiped the excess oil from my fingers using a shop towel, picked up the device, and pressed the green button. I wedged the phone between my ear and my shoulder, freeing my hands to resume buffing the saddle skirt. "Abigail?" my mother said. She spoke in a breathless, rapid cadence, the vocal equivalent of a woman sprinting on a treadmill. The ambient noise in her background consisted of clinking crystal and muffled frantic orders being barked at catering staff. "I have a million things to finalize before the rehearsal dinner, so I will make this brief. The florist just informed me that the imported white peonies require a specific climate-controlled tent, and the event planner is demanding extra staff to manage the lighting rigs. I am operating on 2 hours of sleep, and I am calling to establish a firm understanding regarding the schedule for this weekend." I rubbed the rag along the intricate tooling of the leather, watching the dull surface transform into a rich, glowing mahogany. "I am listening." "The Dalton family is hosting over 400 guests at their private estate," Patricia continued, her voice tightening with a mixture of pride and sheer panic. "The governor will be in attendance. Prominent investors from across the eastern seaboard are flying in to celebrate. The security protocols are extremely strict. I need to be certain you are not planning any last-minute dramatic gestures. You have a history of trying to draw attention to yourself when your sister is thriving, and I will not allow your petty jealousy to cast a shadow over this merger." I paused my polishing for a fraction of a second. The projection was astounding. I had spent my entire life fading into the background, while Vanessa demanded a spotlight, yet my mother had rewritten history to cast me as the attention-seeking villain. I resumed the circular motion with the rag, pressing the wax deeper into the cowhide. "I have no intention of attending," I said evenly. "We already covered this over pot roast." Patricia let out a sharp, dismissive sigh. "People change their minds when they realize what they are missing out on. I cannot afford to take that risk. I had a long conversation with the head of the Dalton private security detail this morning. I provided them with a recent photograph of you." The rag stopped moving. I stared at the dark leather, absorbing the sheer cruelty of her admission. A mother had handed a photograph of her own daughter to armed guards. "I instructed the security team to flag your vehicle," Patricia stated, her tone shifting into a cold, clinical register. "They have strict orders to turn you away at the main gate. If you attempt to cause a scene or force your way onto the property, they will escort you off the premises. I explained to the head guard that you are a disgruntled, estranged relative who struggles with emotional stability. I told them you harbor a deep-seated jealousy regarding Vanessa's success and that you might try to disrupt the ceremony." She had not just banned me, she had preemptively assassinated my character to strangers. She painted me as an unstable threat to justify her own cruel exclusion. She was willing to humiliate me in front of wealthy security contractors just to ensure her flawless aesthetic remained untarnished. The old version of Abigail would have cried. The teenage girl, desperate for maternal affection, would have begged her to rescind the order, promising to wear a designer dress and stand quietly in the corner just to be included in the family portrait. The woman sitting in the tack room felt nothing but a profound, chilling calm. I resumed polishing the saddle. The repetitive, grounding physical motion anchored me in reality, while my mother spun her frantic web of high society lies. The friction of the rag against the leather generated a slight warmth under my fingertips. The leather absorbed the conditioning wax, growing stronger and more resilient with every stroke. I felt my own internal resolve mimicking the material, hardening into an impenetrable shield. "Do you understand me, Abigail?" Patricia demanded, her voice rising in pitch when I failed to provide the tearful reaction she expected. "You will not embarrass this family." I employed the most devastating tactic I had left in my arsenal. I agreed with her. "I understand perfectly, Mom," I said, pitching my voice into a level, sweet melody. It was the exact tone a polite stranger might use to placate an unruly customer. "You do not need to worry about the security team. I promise you I will not set foot on the Dalton property. I will not approach the main gates, and I will not try to speak to Preston. I know exactly where I belong. I will stay right here in the country." My mother fell silent. The sudden, total compliance caught her off guard. She had braced herself for an argument, a bitter shouting match she could use to further justify her narrative of my supposed instability. Instead, I handed her a flawless victory. "Well," Patricia finally said, her tone dripping with smug satisfaction, "I am glad you have finally decided to act like a mature adult. It is better this way for everyone involved. Keep your phone turned off on Saturday. We will speak after the honeymoon." She hung up the phone, severing the connection. I sat in the quiet tack room listening to the faint rustle of the wind moving through the barn rafters. My mother believed she had just neutralized the only threat to Vanessa's fraudulent empire. She thought the fortress walls were secure, relying on armed guards and a fabricated story to keep the bluegrass dirt away from her imported orchids. She had no idea that her demands were the very gears turning the mechanism of my trap. By forcing me to promise I would stay away, she guaranteed my alibi. When the explosion happened, no one would be able to accuse me of crashing the venue or causing a scene. I would be miles away, honoring my mother's explicit instructions. I stood up, leaving the polished saddle resting on the wooden stool. I walked out of the tack room and crossed the dirt aisle into my main office. The encrypted flash drive sat inside the locked bottom drawer of my desk. I retrieved a heavy official veterinary envelope from my filing cabinet. The thick ivory paper bore the embossed crest of Bluegrass Equine Recovery, projecting an air of undeniable professional authority. I picked up the metal flash drive. It contained the toxic blood panels, the forged health certificates, the financial kickback ledgers, and the damning audio confession. It held enough raw truth to shatter the Dalton wedding into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I slipped the drive into the envelope. I peeled the adhesive strip and pressed the flap down, sealing the evidence inside. The edges of the paper felt sharp against my calloused thumbs. My mother had just ensured that I would not be the one to hand this envelope to Preston. I needed a different delivery method, a conduit that could slip past the armed guards and bypass my sister's frantic damage control. I needed someone who commanded more authority than Preston, someone immune to Vanessa's charms and ruthlessly protective of the syndicate's wealth. I pulled a black ink pen from the holder on my desk. I smoothed my hand over the crisp white paper and began to write the name of the Dalton family patriarch. Saturday morning arrived with a flawless pale blue sky stretching over the rolling Kentucky hills. It was the kind of crisp, brilliant summer day that brides pray for and event planners claim credit for delivering. Miles away in Lexington, I knew the sprawling Dalton estate was vibrating with frantic energy. I could picture the scene with vivid clarity. Delivery trucks were likely clogging the manicured driveway, unloading imported orchids and crystal champagne flutes. My mother was undoubtedly marching across the pristine lawns, barking orders at the catering staff while tightly gripping a clipboard. Vanessa would be sequestered in a master suite, surrounded by stylists, sipping mimosas and securing a designer veil over her flawless hair. They were building a temporary, glittering kingdom based entirely on a foundation of stolen research and fraudulent medical records. My morning looked remarkably different. I stood alone in the quiet center aisle of my clinic, holding the thick, ivory veterinary envelope. The air around me carried the familiar, comforting scent of damp earth and alfalfa. I traced the black ink I had used to address the front of the package. I did not direct the evidence to Preston. Confronting the groom on his wedding day would only trigger his protective instincts toward Vanessa, giving my mother the opening she needed to spin the narrative. Instead, the bold letters spelled out the name of the syndicate apex predator, Montgomery Dalton. Montgomery was the ruthless patriarch of the Dalton Empire. He was a man who built a billion-dollar legacy by viewing every single interaction through the lens of a ledger. He did not care about romance aesthetics or high society gossip. He cared about his investments, and he possessed a legendary reputation for destroying anyone who attempted to defraud his family. He was the only person in the state of Kentucky immune to my mother's manipulative tears and my sister's calculated charms. At exactly 8 o'clock, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning silence. A nondescript dark gray sedan pulled up to the main gate. The driver did not honk or attempt to navigate the muddy driveway. He parked neatly near the fencing and stepped out wearing a plain uniform and carrying a digital signature pad. He was a bonded legal courier, an independent contractor I had hired the previous evening. He was not a standard delivery driver. His specific job was to place sensitive legal and financial documents directly into the hands of the designated recipient, bypassing secretaries, security guards, and event planners. I walked out to the gate to meet him. The morning dew soaked into the toes of my boots, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I handed the courier the thick ivory envelope. He glanced down at the bold, undeniable label I had printed across the front, Urgent Medical Liability Report regarding syndicate purchase. It was a title designed to bypass any wedding day pleasantries. It sounded dry, highly official, and alarming enough that a billionaire businessman facing a multi-million-dollar acquisition would tear it open the second it landed in his palm. "The instructions are clear," I asked, my voice steady in the cool morning air. "Yes, ma'am," the courier replied, slipping the envelope into a secure leather satchel resting against his hip. "Direct in-person delivery to Montgomery Dalton at the estate address provided. I will require his personal signature before I release the parcel. No proxies allowed." I reached into the pocket of my denim jacket and pulled out a stack of crisp $20 bills. I counted the cash out into his hand, feeling the textured paper slide between my calloused fingers. I was paying for this delivery using the money I had earned through grueling, honest labor in the dirt. My mother had demanded I hand over my savings to fund imported floral centerpieces for a room I was not allowed to enter. Instead, I was funding the delivery of the unvarnished truth. The courier nodded his thanks, tucked the money away, and returned to his vehicle. I stood by the iron gate and watched the sedan turn around. The tires kicked up a fine gray dust trail as the car sped down the rural road, shrinking into a small dot before disappearing entirely past the tree line. I rested my hands on the cool metal of the gate. The physical transaction was complete, bringing a profound shift in the atmosphere. The burden of proof no longer rested on my shoulders. The conflict was now beyond my control. I had set a delayed fuse, rooting it straight into the heart of the most powerful family in the bluegrass region. I did not need to crash the venue like a dramatic soap opera villain. I did not need to shout over the string quartet or make a spectacle of my own pain. The undeniable facts were traveling down the highway in a leather satchel, poised to detonate right as the extravagant festivities reached their peak. I turned around and walked back toward the clinic. The silence of the property felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an unspoken secret. It was the vast, expansive quiet of genuine freedom. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. The screen lit up, displaying a fresh text message from Patricia. The preview text showed a string of harsh reminders about my promise to stay hidden and out of sight. I did not open the message. I did not read her final desperate attempt to control my behavior. I pressed my thumb against the power button and held it down. A moment later, the screen went black. I severed the digital tether linking me to their toxic world. Walking into the small living quarters attached to the rear of the barn, I shed the lingering tension of the past 3 months. I stripped off the jacket and traded it for my most comfortable worn cotton shirt. I pulled on a pair of faded denim jeans, the fabric soft and familiar against my skin. There was no need to don a tight, restrictive dress or force my feet into painful heels to impress people who fundamentally despised my existence. I returned to the main aisle and headed straight for the feed room. The rich, sweet scent of oats, molasses, and cracked corn filled the enclosed space. I grabbed a large plastic scoop and began measuring out the morning rations. The rhythmic scraping sound of the scoop hitting the bottom of the grain bin provided a soothing mechanical melody. As I pushed the heavy metal feed cart down the concrete aisle, the horses poked their heads over their stall doors, offering low, eager nickers of anticipation. They did not care about the drama unfolding in the city. They only cared that I had shown up to care for them, just as I did every single day. I stopped in front of stall number 4. The dark-coated Dalton stallion stood quietly, his large eyes watching my every movement. I scooped a generous portion of the fortified grain into his corner feeder. He lowered his heavy head, burying his muzzle in the oats. The steady, even sound of his chewing filled the stall. I rested my forearms on the top of the wooden door, watching him eat. By sunset, his wealthy owners would know the truth about his failing bones and the poison running through his veins. They would know he could never race again, but they would also know he had been saved from a catastrophic, fatal breakdown on the track. I took a deep breath, inhaling the dust and the sweet feed. While my sister prepared to march down an aisle built on lies, I stood in the dirt, embodying a total, untouchable peace. The afternoon heat settled over the valley, casting long golden shadows across the pastures. I sat on the weathered wooden steps of my front porch, holding a tall glass of iced sweet tea. The condensation gathered on the outside of the glass, pooling against my fingertips before dripping onto the dry timber beneath my boots. I rocked back slightly, listening to the ice clink against the rim. The sound was bright and sharp in the quiet air. Out here, there were no frantic event planners shouting over walkie-talkies. There was no screaming mother demanding perfection from an exhausted catering staff. There was only the steady breathing of horses in the nearby paddocks and the gentle rustle of wind moving through the ancient oak trees. I knew exactly what time the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I knew the meticulous timeline my mother had obsessed over for 12 agonizing months, treating the schedule like a military battle plan. As I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, savoring the cold sugar and sharp lemon, I pictured the alternate reality unfolding 20 miles away in the city. I would learn the exact details later, piecing the timeline together from breathless local news reports, viral video clips, and society gossip columns. While a renowned string quartet played classical music on the manicured rear lawn of the estate, the dark gray sedan carrying my legal courier pulled up to the imposing wrought iron gates. The private security detail, hyper-vigilant, and holding the photograph my mother had provided of my face, barely glanced twice at the professional delivery driver. They tried to redirect him to the rear service entrance, with the florists and the bakers, but the courier followed my strict instructions. He refused to hand the parcel to a guard. He demanded a direct, in-person audience with Montgomery Dalton. Montgomery was not the kind of man who mingled during a pre-wedding cocktail hour. The Dalton patriarch preferred the quiet authority of his mahogany-paneled study, a room lined with leather-bound financial ledgers and priceless oil paintings of champion thoroughbreds. He was a ruthless architect of wealth, a man who built his sprawling empire by anticipating the weaknesses of his competitors and crushing them without hesitation. He viewed the upcoming marriage not as a romantic fairy tale, but as a strategic social acquisition for his heir. When the courier was finally escorted into the quiet study, Montgomery signed the digital pad with a heavy fountain pen, expecting a routine corporate contract requiring his weekend authorization. He dismissed the guard closing the heavy oak doors. Standing alone in the silence of his office, the billionaire sliced open the thick ivory envelope using a silver letter opener. The patriarch slid the contents onto his expansive desk. The bold header of the medical liability report immediately captured his attention. Montgomery was a seasoned veteran of the racing industry. He knew how to read veterinary diagnostics far better than most licensed practitioners. His sharp eyes scanned the independent blood panels. The staggering levels of synthetic corticosteroids and illegal nerve blockers jumped off the page, painting a grim picture of a dying animal. He traced the timeline connecting the dates of the heavy medication to the exact week his syndicate finalized the multi-million-dollar purchase. Then, Montgomery inserted the encrypted flash drive into his secure desktop terminal. He clicked on the primary video file. The high-definition footage from my barn security system filled his monitor. He watched the pristine white luxury sedan pull up to my clinic. He heard the crisp, undeniable audio of my sister coordinating her illegal kickback over the phone. He listened as Vanessa, dressed in her pre-wedding designer clothing, laughed openly about how gullible and foolish his son was. He heard her explicitly name the corrupt breeding facility and confirm the $500,000 wire transfer scheduled for the following Monday morning. Montgomery Dalton did not throw a tantrum. Billionaires who survive in the cutthroat world of elite equine syndicates do not waste their energy on useless emotional outbursts. They execute calculated retaliation. The patriarch paused the video on Vanessa's sneering face, freezing her arrogant laughter on the screen. He looked out the large bay window of his study. Below him, the extravagant ceremony was just beginning to take shape. He picked up his desk phone and placed two very brief, very quiet calls. The first call went to his lead corporate attorney. The second call went to the head of his private security detail. Outside in the bright summer sunshine, the beautiful illusion remained intact for a little while longer. Social media feeds would later explode with digital evidence of the fleeting triumph. Photographs showed my mother strutting among the regional elite, wearing a custom silk suit and beaming with manufactured pride. Patricia glided past state senators and hedge fund managers, finally achieving the elite high society status she had craved her entire adult life. She believed she had outsmarted everyone, securing her family legacy by keeping her blue-collar daughter hidden in the dirt. Then came the bride. Vanessa walked down the aisle, dripping in borrowed diamonds, her pristine white designer gown catching the sunlight. She played the role of the perfect aristocratic bride with flawless precision, offering a demure, practiced smile to the cameras and a tearful gaze to the groom. Preston held her hands at the altar, looking at her with genuine adoration, entirely unaware that the woman he was about to marry viewed him merely as a naive financial stepping stone. The vows were exchanged under a breathtaking archway of imported white peonies, the very flowers my mother had tried to extort me into financing. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted into polite, restrained applause. The guests transitioned from the manicured garden to the grand ballroom for a reception boasting an astronomical budget. Waiters in crisp tuxedos circulated through the crowd with silver trays of vintage champagne and imported caviar. The elaborate lighting rigs cast a warm, romantic glow over the opulent centerpieces. It was a masterpiece of event planning, a flawless execution of my mother's obsessive vision. Montgomery joined the reception shortly after the grand entrance. He took his seat at the head table, his expression a chilling mask of polite indifference. He lifted his crystal glass to toast the newlyweds, his eyes locking onto Vanessa with a cold, predatory calculation. The bride smiled back, radiating arrogant victory, blind to the invisible trap snapping shut around her ankles. She thought her blue-collar sister was weeping in a dirty barn, defeated and silenced forever. Around the perimeter of the ballroom, subtle shifts were occurring. The Dalton private security guards were no longer watching the doors for party crashers. They were quietly positioning themselves near the main exits. A team of men in dark suits slipped into the venue, hovering near the shadows of the grand staircase, waiting for a signal. The Daltons were arranging their pieces on the board, preparing to execute a devastating checkmate in front of 400 prominent witnesses. Back in the rolling hills of the bluegrass country, I shifted my weight on the wooden porch steps. The late afternoon sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and bruised purple. A cool breeze swept across the valley, rustling the dry leaves in the front yard. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my sweet tea. The ice clinked against the glass again, a clear note ringing out into the tranquil evening. I felt no anxiety, no lingering guilt, and no regret. For the first time in 22 years, I was untethered from the chaotic demands of my toxic lineage. I did not need to monitor my tone or shrink my ambitions to make my sister look taller. I closed my eyes, letting the evening breeze cool the skin on my arms. The quiet out here was profound, stretching out for miles in every direction. It was the deep, resonant silence of a clean conscience. I rested the cold glass against my knee and simply watched the sunset, waiting for the inevitable shockwave to ripple outward from the city. The grand ballroom of the Dalton estate shimmered under the light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers projecting an aura of untouchable wealth. 400 elite guests sat at round tables draped in imported silk. State politicians, hedge fund managers, and equestrian royalty clinked heavy silver forks against fine porcelain plates. Uniformed waiters moved seamlessly through the dense crowd, pouring a rare vintage of dark red wine into towering crystal glasses. At the head table, Vanessa sat enveloped in her $20,000 designer gown. She was the picture of aristocratic perfection, a radiant queen presiding over her newly conquered kingdom. My mother, Patricia, sat 2 seats away, radiating a smug, satisfied triumph. She had orchestrated this exact visual for decades, sacrificing my childhood to build her golden daughter a flawless throne. But a different narrative was unfolding in the shadows, just beyond the ballroom doors. Just before the evening transitioned to the formal toasts, Montgomery Dalton pulled his son into a secluded alcove near the kitchen service hallway. The patriarch did not yell or express frantic emotion. He simply handed Preston a digital tablet displaying the unedited contents of my encrypted flash drive. In the span of 5 minutes, the golden groom watched his entire fairy tale disintegrate into dust. He saw the toxic blood panels detailing the lethal nerve blockers. He read the forged veterinary signatures used to bypass the safety protocols. He listened to the crisp, high-definition audio of his beautiful bride laughing about how gullible he was, bragging about a $500,000 kickback while sealing the fate of a crippled stallion. Preston returned to the head table a fundamentally changed man. His adoring gaze had vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened fury. The master of ceremonies tapped a microphone, signaling the start of the traditional speeches. A respectful hush fell over the expansive room. Preston stood up, holding a full glass of the dark vintage red wine in his right hand. He looked down at Vanessa. She smiled back at him, her eyes wide and expectant, ready to receive a public declaration of his undying love. Patricia leaned forward in her chair, her posture rigid with intense pride, waiting for the Dalton heir to validate her family on a grand stage. Preston brought the microphone to his lips. His voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, crisp and unwavering. "My family built our legacy on a foundation of unshakable trust," Preston began, his gaze scanning the silent crowd of billionaires and socialites. "We honor the thoroughbreds that carry our name. We protect the animals that race under our banner. I thought I found a partner who shared those specific values. I thought I found a woman who understood the grueling, honest reality of the equestrian world." Vanessa preened, a delicate blush coloring her cheeks. She assumed this was the preamble to a glowing compliment about her stolen medical research. Preston turned his body facing his new bride directly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "But I did not find a partner," Preston stated, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "I found a fraud. I found a scam artist who used stolen veterinary research to trick my family into buying a dying, crippled horse." The silence in the ballroom shattered. A low, confused murmur rippled through the sea of guests. Vanessa froze. Her practiced smile slipped her perfectly contoured face, contorting in sudden panic. She reached out, trying to touch his arm, whispering his name in a desperate, pleading tone. Preston stepped back, pulling the microphone off the stand. He was no longer speaking to her. He was addressing the room. "My bride is the sole proprietor of a hidden shell company," Preston announced, his words ringing out like gunshots. "She partnered with a corrupt breeding facility. She forged health clearance documents to hide a severe degenerative bone disease. She authorized the injection of illegal synthetic masking agents into our newest stallion. She willingly risked the life of a jockey and the life of a vulnerable animal just to secure a substantial kickback, which she coordinated over the phone while laughing at my expense." The collective gasp of 400 guests sucked the oxygen out of the room. Smartphones instantly appeared from suit pockets and evening bags, their camera lenses glowing in the dim light. Politicians and business leaders hit the record button, sensing a scandal that would dominate the news cycle for months. Vanessa stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the polished marble floor. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, claiming it was a lie, a terrible misunderstanding. She looked toward Patricia for help. My mother sat paralyzed, her jaw slack, her carefully constructed high society facade crumbling into ash right before her eyes. Preston looked at the woman who had manipulated his affection to fund her greed. The profound betrayal severed his polished, aristocratic restraint. In a moment of sheer, unscripted rage, Preston raised his right hand. He threw the entire glass of vintage red wine directly into Vanessa's face. The visual was stark and devastating. The dark crimson liquid splashed across her shocked features, dripping down her chin and neck. It soaked immediately into the pristine white silk of her expensive designer gown. The rich fabric absorbed the stain, transforming the symbol of her manufactured purity into a ruined, bleeding canvas. The deep red blotch spread across her chest, a permanent, glaring brand marking her deceit. A chaotic frenzy erupted. The flashbulbs of 100 smartphone cameras strobed across the room, illuminating the ruined bride. The digital footage of the wine hitting her face was uploaded to the internet in real time. It caught fire, instantly jumping from private social media feeds to regional news outlets within seconds. The golden wedding of the year had just become a catastrophic public spectacle. Patricia finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The mother who had spent her life demanding quiet compliance from me unleashed a shrill, hysterical scream. She scrambled out of her chair, rushing toward the head table. She tried to grab Preston, shrieking incoherent threats about defamation and ruined reputations. She abandoned every ounce of her polished dignity, exposing the frantic, desperate core of her true nature to the very people she worshipped. Montgomery Dalton gave a subtle nod from the shadows near the kitchen entrance. The Dalton private security detail moved with cold military efficiency. 6 men in dark suits descended upon the head table. They did not shout or argue. They stepped purposefully between Preston and the hysterical women. 2 guards flanked Vanessa, gripping her arms through the ruined, wine-soaked silk. 2 more guards flanked Patricia, cutting off her frantic screaming. "You are trespassing," the lead guard stated, his voice flat and authoritative over the roar of the crowd. "You will leave this property immediately." They marched the disgraced bride and her mother through the exact center of the grand ballroom. The 400 guests parted like a sea, staring in morbid fascination. Vanessa sobbed uncontrollably, her designer heels slipping on the marble floor, the red wine dripping onto the polished tiles, leaving a visible trail. Patricia stumbled beside her, weeping and hiding her face from the relentless glare of the recording smartphones. They were paraded past the imported floral arrangements they had tried to extort me to buy. They were escorted out the heavy oak doors, pushed down the grand front steps, and expelled into the humid night air. The heavy wrought iron gates of the Dalton estate clanged shut behind them, locking them out of the kingdom they had tried to steal. The illusion was dead. The silence I had preserved in the country had given way to a deafening roar in the city. The trap had closed, sealing their fate under the watchful eye of a million glowing screens. The sun finally slipped below the jagged tree line, pulling a deep, bruised indigo twilight across the rolling hills. The heavy humidity of the afternoon broke, replaced by a cool, fragrant evening breeze that carried the scent of cured hay and damp earth. I sat on the wooden porch of my small living quarters, the floorboards groaning softly as I shifted my weight. The rhythmic chirping of crickets started up in the tall grass, a familiar, steady chorus that signaled the end of another honest day. Everything in my sanctuary remained exactly as it should be. The horses were fed, the barn was secure, and the air was still. I reached into the pocket of my faded denim jeans and retrieved my cell phone. The screen had been dark for hours. I pressed the power button, feeling a brief hollow vibration against my palm as the device booted up. I expected a flurry of digital activity, but I underestimated the sheer velocity of high society gossip. The moment the phone connected to the cellular network, the screen froze. The processor struggled to handle the incoming data. Notifications flooded the display in a relentless, blinding cascade. Text messages, missed call alerts, and social media tags piled on top of one another so quickly that the interface locked up for a full minute. When the operating system finally stabilized, I tapped the screen and opened my messages. My inbox was overflowing with texts from people I had not spoken to in years. Old high school classmates, distant cousins, and local equestrian equipment vendors were all sending variations of the same frantic question. They wanted to know if I had seen the news. They wanted to know if the rumors were true. I bypassed their invasive curiosity and opened a regional news application. The scandal had already dominated the evening broadcast cycle. Every local news channel and equestrian blog featured the same breaking story. The headlines were plastered across the digital front pages in bold, unforgiving type. They called it the wine incident. The narrative had escaped the confines of the Dalton estate and morphed into an unprecedented public spectacle. I scrolled past the sensational headlines and found the official press release issued by the Dalton Racing Syndicate. Montgomery Dalton had not waited for the weekend to conclude. He had unleashed his corporate legal team the moment the disgraced bride was escorted off his property. The statement was a masterclass in ruthless, calculated public relations. The syndicate formally announced the immediate cancellation of the wedding and the severance of all personal ties with the Beatrice family. Montgomery did not stop at a social excommunication. The press release outlined a sweeping legal offensive. The syndicate confirmed they were pressing felony fraud charges against Vanessa and the principals of Ironwood Equine. The document detailed a staggering conspiracy, citing the procurement of forged veterinary clearance forms and the intentional concealment of a degenerative equine bone disease using illicit synthetic narcotics. The authorities were already involved. State Racing Commission investigators had secured warrants to audit the breeding facility. My sister was not just facing a canceled honeymoon and a ruined reputation. She was facing the very real prospect of a criminal trial and a lengthy prison sentence. The lucrative consulting firm she had registered to collect her illicit kickback was now ground zero for a federal investigation. I closed the press release and clicked on the top trending video link circulating across every social media platform. The footage was shaky, recorded on a smartphone from a guest seated near the head table in the grand ballroom. I watched the scene unfold on the small, glowing screen. I saw Preston standing with the microphone, his voice echoing with cold, hard betrayal. I watched Vanessa, sitting in her $20,000 designer gown, her face contorting in genuine panic as the illusion shattered around her. Then came the moment of unscripted retribution. Preston raised his crystal glass and hurled the dark, vintage red wine directly into her face. I watched the crimson liquid splash across her carefully styled hair and drip down her chin. I watched the expensive white silk absorb the dark stain, ruining the pristine aesthetic she had weaponized against me for 2 decades. The guests in the background gasped, their shocked expressions immortalized in high definition. The video ended with the Dalton private security guards marching a weeping, shivering Vanessa and a frantic, screaming Patricia through the center of the ballroom, parading their disgrace in front of 400 prominent witnesses. I tapped the screen, pausing the video on the final frame of my sister, shivering in her ruined dress, escorted out of the glittering world she had lied to conquer. I lowered the phone to my lap. I picked up the tall glass resting beside my boot on the wooden porch. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my iced sweet tea. The cold liquid tasted sharp and grounding. I did not feel an overwhelming surge of triumphant joy. I did not want to laugh or gloat over their misery. I merely observed the inevitable collapse of an architecture built on a foundation of lies. For her entire adult life, my mother had treated her social reputation as her primary currency. She had sacrificed my emotional health, hidden my achievements, and demanded my constant submission just to ensure her standing at the country club remained pristine. She traded her maternal duties for invitations to elite galas. Now that currency was utterly and publicly annihilated. The Beatrice name was no longer associated with quiet elegance or wealthy mergers. It was synonymous with a cheap, desperate criminal hustle. They would never be invited to another charity dinner. They would be shunned in the grocery store aisles. They had lost the only thing they ever truly valued. The quiet evening air was suddenly pierced by a harsh, grating ringtone. My phone vibrated furiously against my thigh. The caller identification flashed on the screen. It Patricia. I stared at the name for a long moment. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of the line. She was likely standing in the driveway of their Lexington home, her expensive silk suit stained and wrinkled, watching her carefully constructed universe burn to ash. I swiped my thumb across the glass, accepting the call. I brought the speaker to my ear. "Abigail!" Patricia shrieked. Her voice was not the polished, commanding tone of a high society matriarch. It was a guttural, frantic scream, raw with panic and unhinged fury. "You did this! You sent those documents! You ruined everything!" She continued to scream, her words blurring together into a senseless, hysterical tirade. She threatened to sue me. She threatened to disown me. She demanded I call Montgomery Dalton and retract the evidence, insisting I tell the authorities that I had fabricated the blood panels out of spite. She was drowning in the consequences of her own actions, desperately clawing for someone else to pull under the water with her. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or attempt to defend my actions. I simply listened to the chaotic noise pouring out of the speaker, realizing that she possessed no power over me anymore. Her threats were empty. Her rage was impotent. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the red circle on the digital display. I pressed my finger against the glass, ending the call mid-sentence. Then I navigated to her contact profile. I scrolled down to the bottom of the menu and tapped the option to block the caller. I repeated the process for Vanessa, and then for my father. I severed the digital lifelines, locking them out of my world just as firmly as they had locked me out of their venue. I set the phone face down on the wooden porch. The crickets continued their rhythmic chirping in the tall grass. A profound, weightless relief washed over me. I was finally free. I had survived their venom, preserved my integrity, and protected an innocent animal from a fatal breakdown. Yet I knew the silence would not last forever. Toxic people do not simply accept defeat and fade into the shadows. When their social capital evaporates and their financial resources dry up, they inevitably look for a new source of survival. I leaned back against the wooden railing, watching the stars emerge in the dark Kentucky sky, knowing that a desperate, cornered animal would eventually come crawling back to my gate. 7 days passed in the Bluegrass Valley, a week during which the social landscape of Lexington underwent a violent and permanent tectonic shift. In the high society circles where my mother had spent decades curating her immaculate reputation, the fallout was swift and merciless. The Dalton Racing Syndicate did not issue empty threats. Montgomery Dalton moved with the cold, unyielding precision of a corporate predator, freezing the assets associated with Vanessa and the shady breeding operation. Legal notices arrived at my parents' house in rapid succession, detailing multi-million-dollar lawsuits for fraud, breach of contract, and intentional misrepresentation. The consulting firm my sister registered had its accounts locked by federal investigators, evaporating the promise of her illegal $500,000 kickback before she ever saw a single cent. Worse than the financial ruin was the social exile. In a tightly knit community built on equine pedigree and family honor, a public scandal of that magnitude acted like a localized plague. The country club committees quietly scrubbed my mother's name from their active rosters. The charitable boards she chaired abruptly stopped returning her phone calls. The friends who had sipped vintage champagne at her home and fawned over her wedding arrangements vanished into thin air, blocking her number and crossing to the other side of the street whenever she appeared in public. The fortress of status she had constructed over 40 years collapsed overnight, leaving her exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of day. I watched the local digital columns from a safe distance, tending to my horses and managing my growing client roster. My clinic was thriving. Word of my discreet, highly effective rehabilitation protocols had spread among independent trainers who respected competence over pedigree. I was busy working in the back paddock when the familiar crunch of tires on gravel pulled my attention toward the front entrance of the property. I paused, resting my hand on the flank of a recovering bay gelding, and looked down the long gravel drive. A dusty mid-sized sedan crawled up the lane, stopping awkwardly a few feet short of the main security gate. It was not the spotless luxury vehicle my mother usually drove. It was an ordinary car looking tired and road-worn, mirroring the people stepping out from the front seats. Patricia and Thomas emerged into the bright afternoon sun. The transformation in my mother was staggering. The polished, impeccably tailored matriarch who had strutted through elite galas was completely gone. She wore a rumpled linen blouse that looked as though it had not seen an iron in a week, and her hair lacked its usual expensive styling. Her face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion and bitter humiliation. My father trailed a step behind her, carrying himself with a heavy, defeated slouch, his shoulders permanently rounded under the weight of a lifetime of cowardice. They walked up to the iron gate, stopping just outside the boundary of my property. Patricia reached out a manicured hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the vertical steel bars. She looked through the gaps at me, her expression shifting through a dozen different emotional gears before settling into a fragile, rehearsed mask of maternal warmth. I walked slowly down the gravel path, stopping 10 feet away from the gate. I did not unlock the heavy deadbolt. I did not swing the metal barrier open to welcome them inside. I simply stood there, with my hands resting casually in the pockets of my jeans, maintaining a safe, unbreakable distance. "Abigail," Patricia said, her voice cracking slightly, abandoning the shrill scream of the previous week in favor of a soft, fragile whisper. "Thank God you are here. We have been driving for an hour trying to find someone who would listen to reason." I did not answer. I just watched her, letting the silence stretch between us. "It has been a complete nightmare," Patricia continued, taking a step forward until her knuckles pressed against the iron bars. "The lawyers are demanding retainers we cannot afford. Your sister is beside herself, locked in her bedroom and refusing to eat. Our accounts are frozen, and people we thought were lifelong friends are pretending they do not even know us. We are facing financial ruin, Abigail. We need your help." Thomas stepped up to his wife, finally lifting his head to meet my gaze. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "Your mother is right, honey," he said, his voice raspy and devoid of authority. "We are still your family. No matter what happened in the past, family is supposed to stand together when things get hard. We need you to use some of your business savings to help us retain a good defense attorney for Vanessa. We need you to stand by us." There it was, the ultimate fallback card of every toxic dynamic. When manipulation failed, when status crumbled, and when the consequences of their own cruelty came home to roost, they suddenly remembered the concept of family unity. For 22 years, my family had defined family as a hierarchy where I occupied the bottom tier, designed to be overlooked, underfunded, and silenced. Now they expected me to empty the accounts of the business I built with my own hands to bail them out of a federal fraud investigation. I looked at my mother, seeing the stark reality of her desperation. She had spent a lifetime teaching me that love was conditional, that support was a transaction, and that I was merely a tool to be used when convenient and discarded when inconvenient. I did not feel angry. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive satisfaction. I felt a profound, crystal-clear indifference. "Family stands together," I repeated softly, letting the phrase hang in the quiet air between us. Patricia nodded eagerly, her eyes lighting up with a dangerous flicker of hope, mistaking my quiet tone for a softening of my resolve. "Yes, exactly, Abigail. That is what we are saying. We are your blood. We can put the past behind us. We can start over." I shook my head slowly, my expression remaining entirely neutral. "You taught me a very valuable lesson about how this family operates, Mom," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the iron bars. "You taught me that we can only show up for one of us at a time. You made your choice very clear over the years. You chose Vanessa, comfort over my education. You chose her wedding over my presence. You chose to lock me out of your world because my presence embarrassed your social standing." Patricia opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand slightly, stopping her words before they could form. "When you banned me from the venue and told me to stay away, you gave me a very specific instruction," I continued, recalling the exact phrasing she had used on the day the wedding invitations were distributed. "You told me not to ruin her big day. You told me to just sit this one out." The color drained completely from my mother's face. The memory of her own cruel dismissal hung in the air like a physical weight. "Well," I said, looking her dead in the eye, "I took your advice. I sat your entire wedding out. And now I am simply going to sit this crisis out, too." Patricia let out a sharp gasp, the fragile mask of maternal warmth shattering instantly. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, her voice spiking back into its familiar frantic register. "We are your parents. We raised you. You owe us everything. You have "I owe you nothing," I replied steadily. "I built this clinic with my own two hands, without a single penny of your support, and in spite of your constant attempts to undermine me. You came out here expecting a walking ATM, but you found out the account is permanently closed." Thomas stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, realizing that his passive pleading carried no weight anymore. He had chosen his side years ago in a diner booth, stirring his black coffee while pretending my sister crimes did not exist. Now he was reaping the harvest of his own cowardice. I turned my back on them without another word. I did not slam a door or raise my voice. I simply pivoted on the heel of my boot and began walking back down the gravel path toward the main barn. Behind me, Patricia began to scream, pounding her fists against the cold steel of the locked iron gate, hurling insults and empty threats into the empty afternoon air. Her voice echoed off the wooden fencing, growing fainter with every step I took. I did not look back. I did not slow my pace. I walked past the rolling pastures and the grazing horses, letting the distance between us grow until her frantic shrieks dissolved completely into the peaceful rustle of the bluegrass wind. That moment crystallized the hardest, most liberating psychological lesson of my life. You cannot heal a toxic family dynamic by endlessly sacrificing your own well-being. No amount of hard work, compliance, or forgiveness will ever satisfy people who view your existence as a threat to their ego. The only way to survive a system built on conditional affection and exploitation is to refuse to play the game altogether. Healing does not come from fixing them. It comes from walking away and closing the door behind you. My boundary was permanent load-bearing and absolute. They were stranded in the driveway of a life they had dismantled themselves, staring at a gate that would never open again. I walked into the cool shade of the barn, sliding my hands into my pockets, ready to greet the rest of my life. 6 months passed, turning the humid Kentucky summer into a crisp, biting winter, and finally softening into a bright, promising spring. The rolling hills of the Bluegrass Valley turned a vibrant emerald green. The morning frost melted away from the wooden fence lines, leaving the pastures rich and ready for a new season of intensive rehabilitation. My clinic, Bluegrass Equine Recovery, operated at maximum capacity. We maintained a waiting list spanning 3 different counties. I hired 2 assistant veterinary technicians to manage the significantly increased workload. The steady income allowed me to upgrade our diagnostic equipment and build a state-of-the-art hydrotherapy waiting pool. Wyatt finally allowed himself to take Sundays off to rest his bad knee, trusting me to run the facility without his constant supervision. The world outside my quiet valley looked remarkably different for the people who had tried to destroy me. The legal gears of the state justice system turned slowly, but with devastating certainty. Vanessa was formally indicted on multiple felony counts of wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. Her trial date was set for the upcoming autumn. The expensive defense attorneys she initially retained dropped her case the moment her retainer checks bounced. The frozen syndicate assets and the crippling civil lawsuits drained every single account she possessed. My sister, the woman who had banned me from her wedding for being an aesthetic liability, was now working a minimum wage job as a cashier at a chain grocery store on the industrial outskirts of Lexington. She wore a scratchy polyester uniform and stood on her feet for 8 hours a day, ringing up bruised produce and scanned coupons just to afford the hourly rate of an overworked public defender. The glamorous life she tried to steal had vanished, replaced by the grueling, exhausting reality of the working class she used to openly mock. Patricia suffered a fate that, in her eyes, was far worse than financial ruin or legal prosecution. She became a ghost in her own hometown. The social exile was permanent and unrelenting. The prominent country club formally revoked her membership, citing a violation of their morality clause. Her former friends, the wealthy socialites she had desperately courted for decades, pretended they did not see her in public. They crossed the street when she approached and blocked her phone number. She spent her days trapped inside her quiet, heavily mortgaged house, cut off from the glittering world she had sacrificed her soul to join. The toxic architecture my parents built on deception and status had collapsed into an inescapable prison of their own making. I didn't revel in their misery. I didn't waste my energy feeling vindictive or triumphant. I simply acknowledged their absence from my life and moved forward with a clear conscience. On a cool Tuesday morning in early April, the steady routine of my clinic was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black luxury town car. The vehicle glided up the long gravel driveway, stopping neatly near the main barn entrance. The uniformed driver stepped out, opening the rear passenger door. Montgomery Dalton emerged into the morning sunlight. The billionaire racing patriarch wore a pristine charcoal gray tailored suit. His silver hair was combed perfectly into place, projecting an aura of immense authority. He looked like a man stepping out of a corporate boardroom, yet he navigated the dirt and gravel of my stable yard with a quiet, commanding confidence. He didn't look at my rustic facility with the same disgust my mother had shown. His sharp eyes scanned the clean concrete aisles, the organized tack room, and the healthy, recovering horses standing peacefully in their stalls. He was evaluating the operation, and he clearly respected the undeniable results of hard labor. I stood near the outdoor wash rack, holding a damp sponge and wearing a faded flannel shirt over my denim jeans. I wiped the suds from my hands with a shop towel and walked forward to greet him. Montgomery stopped a few feet away, observing me with a calculated, piercing gaze. "Abigail," Montgomery said, his voice deep and resonant in the quiet yard. "I appreciate you making time for me without a scheduled appointment. It is not every day the head of the Dalton Racing Syndicate visits a rural rehabilitation yard," I replied, keeping my tone professional, respectful, and entirely steady. Montgomery offered a rare, subtle smile. "I prefer to conduct my most important business in person. I never had the opportunity to properly thank you for the delivery you arranged last August. The evidence you provided saved my family from making a disastrous, highly embarrassing investment. More importantly, you saved a valuable animal from a fatal breakdown on the track. That stallion is currently enjoying a peaceful retirement on a private farm, all thanks to your intervention." "I only delivered the truth," I said, looking him in the eye. "What you chose to do with it was your decision." "Integrity is a rare commodity in this industry," Montgomery stated, stepping closer. "Most people would have used that sensitive information to extort a settlement. Some would have run straight to the press for a brief moment of fame. You simply sent the facts to the one person who needed to see them, and then you went back to work. I value that kind of quiet competence." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, formal contract printed on heavy bond paper. He held the document out to me. "My syndicate is restructuring our entire veterinary and rehabilitation department," Montgomery explained. "We are cutting ties with the high society clinics that prioritize aesthetics and kickbacks over equine health. I want to offer you an exclusive, highly lucrative contract to manage the physical therapy and recovery protocols for every horse under the Dalton banner. You will have full medical autonomy, a substantial operational budget to expand this facility, and direct access to my top trainers. We need your unmatched skill and we need your honesty." I looked down at the contract in his hand. The offer represented a monumental shift in my career trajectory. It was the kind of professional endorsement that most practitioners spend a lifetime chasing. It guaranteed the financial security of my clinic for the next decade, ensuring I could hire the best staff and purchase the most advanced medical equipment. It was the ultimate validation of the grueling, dirty work I had chosen over my family's hollow prestige. I reached out and took the document. Montgomery extended his right hand. I looked down at my own hand. My fingers were calloused, stained with liniment, and covered by a dusty leather work glove. I didn't take the glove off. I didn't apologize for the dirt or the grime. I grasped his hand firmly. The physical contrast was stark and beautiful. The billionaire in his pristine luxury suit shook hands with the rural equine therapist in dusty leather gloves. In that simple, quiet gesture, the deep cultural divide of the Kentucky bluegrass was bridged by a foundation of mutual respect. He didn't care that I lacked a country club pedigree or a famous last name. He cared that I was the best in the state at what I did. I had built my own empire, not by pretending to be someone else to gain social approval, but by mastering exactly who I truly was. "I look forward to our partnership," Abigail, Montgomery said, giving my hand one final firm squeeze before releasing his grip. He turned and walked back to his waiting town car. I stood in the bright morning sun, holding the contract against my chest. The black vehicle rolled away, kicking up a familiar trail of gray dust that settled quietly onto the grass. I turned around and walked back into the barn. The horses were waiting, and there was honest work to be done. I spent my entire youth believing that I needed to change myself to earn a seat at my family's dining table. I thought my value was tied to their acceptance, and I twisted myself into knots trying to be the perfect invisible daughter. I learned the hard way that shrinking yourself to fit into a toxic environment will only suffocate your spirit and blind you to your own potential. You don't have to fight for a seat at a table where you are disrespected. You can just build your own table. Thank you for listening to my story today on QT Told Stories. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, I want to hear from you. Share your own stories of setting boundaries in the comments below. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about reclaiming your power. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and I will see you in the next video. I look out my window at the sprawling American suburbs where manicured lawns and perfectly painted fences often hide the quiet desperation humming within the walls. As a spiritual observer of our modern culture, I see a society heavily burdened by the weight of aesthetics, social currency, and material success. We are running a relentless race, curating our lives for an invisible audience, hoping that if our lives look beautiful on the outside, we will not have to deal with the emptiness on the inside. It is within this high-pressure landscape that the story of Abigail and the Beatrice family serves as a profound allegory. It is not merely a tale of a ruined wedding or a stolen identity. It is a vital spiritual mirror held up to the face of modern parenting. It asks us to strip away the illusion of the perfect family and confront the deeper virtues we are passing down to the next generation. For parents navigating the complexities of raising children today, this narrative offers a guiding light to return to what truly matters. We live in an era where every milestone is heavily curated for public consumption. Patricia's fatal flaw was not simply greed, it was a tragic misunderstanding of worth. She mistook her social reputation for her actual value, investing all her energy into the appearance of success. She chased designer gowns, wealthy in-laws, and imported orchids entirely blind to the moral rot decaying the foundation of her home. For parents navigating today's image-driven world, true wisdom lies in dismantling this illusion. We must teach our children to discern the difference between what shines in the spotlight and what sustains in the dark. It is a harsh but necessary truth. We must stop raising children to be trophies that validate our own parenting or elevate our social standing. When we treat a child as an extension of our own ego, we hollow them out. A child's true value resides in their character, their resilience, and their honesty. It is found in how they treat others when no one is watching, not in how seamlessly their life translates to a glossy photograph or a boastful dinner party anecdote. The deepest tragedy of the Beatrice family is that love was treated as a transactional currency. Vanessa was rewarded with affection, financial backing, and protection because she fit a specific, prestigious mold that served her mother's ambitions. Abigail, on the other hand, was starved of that same affection because her authentic, blue-collar life embarrassed her mother's fragile ego. This division breeds a toxic environment where children learn to manipulate, grow anxious, and ultimately disconnect from their true selves just to survive in their own homes. Morality begins at the kitchen table through unconditional acceptance. We must love our children for who they are, not for who they can become to make us look better. Furthermore, the story highlights the devastating cost of passive enabling within a traditional family structure. Thomas, the father, committed a quiet but profound moral failure. He chose the comfort of a peaceful household over the courage to stop a severe wrong. Moral courage requires standing up for what is right, even when it disrupts the fragile peace of your own living room. Fathers and mothers alike share the responsibility of being pillars of fairness. We must model for our children that integrity is non-negotiable. Fairness is not about keeping everyone quiet, it is about holding everyone accountable. When a parent turns a blind eye to a sibling's cruelty just to avoid conflict, they teach the victim that their pain does not matter, and they teach the aggressor that their behavior has no bounds. When we think of willpower, our culture often confuses it with dominance, aggression, or having the last word. We are taught to fight back, to raise our voices, and to demand our space. But Abigail's ultimate victory did not come from screaming, seeking revenge, or actively plotting to destroy her sister. Her true power was demonstrated through profound restraint. She refused to be baited into a petty fight. She refused to compromise her professional ethics. She simply laid the undeniable truth on the table and let consequence do the rest. As parents, we must teach our children the strength of the quiet boundary. True spiritual and emotional willpower is the ability to remain deeply rooted in your own truth when the world, or even your own family, demands that you compromise. We must instill in our children the understanding that they do not have to set themselves on fire to keep others warm. The highest form of strength they can master is learning to walk away from toxicity with a quiet, unshakable peace. It is the realization that you do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. The greatest inheritance you can leave your children is not a trust fund, a prestigious last name, or a coveted seat at a high society table. The ultimate legacy is the spiritual fortitude to build their own table one, where honesty, hard work, and mutual respect are the only currencies that matter. It is a heavy responsibility to raise emotionally aware, grounded individuals, but it is the only way to break the cycle of generational trauma. We must guide them to seek genuine connection over superficial applause, ensuring they have the inner strength to stand alone if the crowd is moving in the wrong direction. If you found resonance in Abigail's journey and want to continue exploring the deep, complex dynamics of family boundaries and personal growth, I encourage you to subscribe and follow our channel, QT Told Stories. We share narratives that challenge the surface level of our lives and invite us to look deeper into our own hearts. Join our community as we navigate the difficult but rewarding path of self-discovery. I sit in the quiet of my own home watching the evening light stretch long across the floorboards, and I wonder about the tables we are all setting. We spend so much time arranging the centerpieces, polishing the silver, and ensuring the guest list looks right to the outside world. But when the lights go down, the cameras are put away, and the guests finally leave, who is left sitting with us? Are we surrounded by people who love us for the truth of who we are? Or are we surrounded by strangers wearing the faces of our family? The answer, I suppose, depends entirely on what we are willing to tolerate before we finally decide to stand up, push our chairs back, and walk out the door.